Yes. Hi, Moshe. Thank you for giving us this interview for Enlace Judío. What does it mean, a Gueniza?
Gueniza is a place in a synagogue in which Jews put sacred texts after they no longer need it. And as a whole, Gueniza is a Jewish law that many people still preserve up today. And in many cases, after putting it in a box in a synagogue, it is taken into a graveyard and buried. But in Cairo, there was a very special case in which a certain chamber or room was used for Gueniza for almost a millennium. And thanks to the dry climate conditions in Cairo, 300,000 fragments of Jewish books were deposited in it and were preserved actually up to this current day.
Okay, and what is the purpose of your trip to Mexico?
Yeah, so I came here to Mexico with a Gueniza exhibition prepared in the new Gueniza Research Center in the University of Haifa. And our center is a center that wishes to promote the research of the Gueniza on one hand, but on the other hand, to advance the familiarity of the wider public in the Jewish world and at all with this great treasure of Jewish history and texts. And actually, the exhibition I brought with me and the lectures I brought with me are telling the story, a story, which is to a certain extent similar to what we are trying to do. Because the Gueniza is like a sacred trash, and everything goes there. It's not only a place where you find Bible, Siddur, Talmud, or a book of Maimonides. It's also a place where you find the notes of a child. It's also a place where you find the recipe prepared by a doctor. It's also a place where you find the preparation of a rabbi for tomorrow morning service. And therefore, the Gueniza in itself can tell us a story in which the Jewish life and even the social life of the Jews among their colleagues or among the nations with which they live can be seen. And it's a story not only of intellectuals and not only of theory, it's also a story of how theory makes its way into daily life. Okay?
Are there other Guenizot in the world?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that in many synagogues today there are Guenizot. Even yes, in the sense that a project in Germany is currently finding Guenizot in where synagogues were. And yes, in the sense that we may guess that in some other synagogues, somewhere in the world, there's still more materials that can be found. Yet, the case of the Cairo Gueniza is something that so far we did not find, and I assume that we will not find, because the combination of a synagogue that has 1,000 years of continuity in a place which was a merchandise center connecting India and Yemen and the Maghreb, North Africa, and Baghdad, and up to the European areas. And therefore, I would say almost took into itself so many materials in every single field that cover the life of the Jews from a span that goes from India to England. Such a Gueniza we probably cannot find in any other place.
When was the Cairo Gueniza discovered?
Well, people fight about this question. We have evidence of familiarity with the Gueniza that goes hundreds of years ago. People wrote that there is a treasure in Cairo, and there are snakes guarding it, and so on. And in a very gradual process, as modern Western European people went into the east and went into the Levant, some people started taking materials from the Gueniza in Cairo and to bring those materials with them to many universities and museums, libraries in the world. Yet it was in 1896 when two Scottish ladies sent a certain manuscript to Cambridge, a manuscript of Ben Sira, Second Temple Lost Work, and this made Solomon Schechter and Charles Taylor understand how important is the Gueniza, and whatever was left in the Gueniza up to that moment was taken into Cambridge. So 1896 is considered like the finding of the Gueniza, but it's actually the last step of taking Gueniza material into other places, scattered today all over the world.
When did you start studying Gueniza, about the Gueniza?
I think there are two answers to this question. The more formal one would say, I did a postdoc in the Hebrew University in a group that dealt with Gueniza and questions of canonicity of books. Until then, I worked more on Jewish thought, Talmud, and Midrash from more conceptual perspectives. And then I started to research in the Gueniza. Yet, if I recall my own biography, I studied while I was doing my PhD, I studied in a yeshiva, who was a liberal Orthodox, modern Orthodox yeshiva, where academic perspectives were very welcomed. And therefore, we were exposed to what's going on also in the academic world. And we had guest lecturers. And one of them was Stefan Reif, who was the head of the Gueniza unit in Cambridge, and now is the chair of our center in Haifa, of the board of our center in Haifa. And he came and he gave a lecture about the Gueniza, and I think about 15 years later, the seeds of his lecture suddenly became into my research field.
Okay. Where are the documents, the manuscripts on the Cairo Gueniza? Where are they located?
Today, where are they located?
Yes.
So, as I mentioned, most of them, about 2/3, are in Cambridge. But because the Gueniza was scattered even before in many other places, there are big collections in New York, in London, in St. Petersburg, and some small collections. We in Haifa, we have 23 fragments out of 300,000. Yet, the truth is that today the fragments are located physically in many libraries, but virtually in a very helpful website, which is called the Friedberg Gueniza or Genazim project. So this website has almost all Gueniza fragments in the world available for scholars, and therefore we in Haifa, where we only have 23 fragments, could launch some projects of research where we can access all the fragments in the world. In our vision, the next step of accessibility is to make this huge collection available also for the wider public. Everyone can register today to the website, but it is built for scholars. And we hope to be able to develop some tools that would make it very user-friendly and would make it accessible for people to see Gueniza fragments wherever they are, in whatever context of education or Jewish communities that want to set something, or someone who wants to research his own kehillah of origin and so on. That's our vision. Yes.
What kind of documents can we see at the Cairo Gueniza?
So many kinds of documents in so many languages that we can hardly even start. I don't know how much of the exhibition behind me the camera can see, but if we just go through the lines that we have here, behind my back is a siddur in which a midrashic text is quoted. Under it is an Aramaic targum of the Bible. Here we find some Judeo-Arabic adaptation of Midrashim. And to the left, we find some historical documents, including letters written and signed by Maimonides there, and by Rabbi Yosef Karo, and so on and so on. Every kind of written piece that you can imagine, be it a book, a letter, religious text, secular text, poetry, prose, prayer, liturgy, endless. It's a treasure of variety. And maybe one story about a fragment which is actually a letter that a child wrote to his friends, complaining about his father, who grounded him at home. And the Jewish child in the 11th century, describing his suffer, and he's quoting Job to describe how great is his suffer. So even that.
Okay. And how old are the documents of the Cairo Gueniza?
Okay. Well, the classical Gueniza period, most of the documents are from the 11th to the 13th century. Yet some of them goes back to the 10th and maybe the 9th, and others proceed up to the 19th century. Yet, especially in my field of rabbinic literature, which was oral law, then even if the document was written in the 9th or the 10th century, in many cases it gives us insights, or it's actually a text that was produced or redacted in the 3rd century, in the 5th century, and so on. And usually it's only in the Gueniza that we find the earliest versions and attestations of such texts. And in very, very few rare cases, such as Ben Sira that I mentioned earlier, such as one of Qumran documents that made its way also to the Gueniza and is also here in the exhibition, even if the text was written in the 10th century, the content goes back to Second Temple days.
I heard that some of the documents in the Gueniza are more important than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Is it true?
Well, the Dead Sea Scroll Gueniza fight is a very long fight. I always prefer not to speak in a language of that against that, but a language that envision the qualities and the positive qualities of each collection. And the Qumran collection is mainly important because it shed light on elements that was entirely lost and forgotten from Second Temple days. The Gueniza is important mainly because it gives us a full coverage of Jewish society in Middle Ages, in such a scrutiny of details that enable us to see people in their workshop, in their daily life. So in terms of the extent, 300,000 documents, clearly the Gueniza is more powerful than the 8,000 documents of Qumran. Now, an important aspect is that Qumran was a treasure for two religions, Jews and Christians, because it's also important for the birth of Christianity. And therefore, Qumran got intensive academic attention, and all 8,000 fragments they have are now transcribed, available, you can Google search for them, and so on. We in the Gueniza, such a treasure, but mainly important for Jews. And Jews is a very small people, so in order to be able to have all this treasure available for the entire world, there's still a lot of work to be done. So you know what? I cannot tell which one is more important. I can tell which one deserves now a larger investment. Yes.
Okay. At this time, what type of document are discarded into a Gueniza? At this time, which kind of documents?
You mean in modern days?
Yes, in modern days.
Well, it's interesting because first it's varied from different Jewish communities. And usually Orthodox or I would say practicing Jews, observant Jews will put into Gueniza every text that has any relation to to religious life. So imagine like a synagogue weekly update, okay? There's a Dvar Torah of the rabbi. So someone will put it today in the Gueniza. But in the synagogue weekly update, you also have which events the community has today, who died, who was born, welcome to new members, what kind of events we are doing with our fellow neighbors in the Christian church, and so on. So the Gueniza, even today, is actually a place where that collect materials that can tell the daily life of the Jews today. And okay, so this is also the Gueniza of the medieval days.
Is it true that also in a Gueniza you can find books or documents that have some type of error, that are not well written or with some...
Yes, clearly it's true, because we can even find children's notebook who are practicing, and they do error, and scribes did error, and scribes sometimes also changed because they thought it's reasonable to change. And in many cases, error is an important historical data, not less than the correct version of an ancient text.
Okay. Can we know how big was the Jewish community studying the documents of the Cairo Gueniza?
Because the coverage of the Cairo Gueniza is of such a long period, it's difficult to give a clear answer for that question. Clearly some efforts were done to assess the differences in sizes, and we have to remember that the Cairo Gueniza, because materials arrived from all over the world, is not only telling us about the Egyptian Jewish community in Egypt, but Jewish communities all over the world. And we can mainly learn about, not about how big was a community, but about the very presence of some communities which we thought that were lost before. For example, many Jews followed the practice of the Jews of the land of Israel, which was different than the practice of the Jews in Babylon. Today, most Jewish communities follow the Babylonian tradition and whatever evolved from it. But in the Cairo Gueniza, we find many sidurim and many documents and many piyutim, liturgical poetry, that tells us the story of Palestinian Jews, or Ashamiyin, Jews of Asham, namely of the area of the land of Israel, which was different. So we know about communities that we didn't know that will still exist at a much later time.
Okay. What can the documents of the Gueniza tell us about Moshe ben Maimon and also Joseph Caro?
Well, because it's such a big treasure, and because Maimonides was living in Cairo for and almost most of his life after immigrating from Spain, then the Gueniza is the place where we find his own letters, where we find his own medical writings, when we find his own prescriptions as a doctor, which you will find in the other section on the other side, where the medical knowledge in the Gueniza, also research in Haifa, is presented. So we have here his own handwrite of a book on medical issues, his own prescription he wrote to one of his students, his signature on a letter, and so on and so on. And it really sheds light about Maimonides as a doctor, as a halachist, as a philosopher, as a commentator. He wrote some drafts of commentaries to the Yerushalmi, which were not published, as they are found in the Gueniza. And also Maimonides as a political leader, and also as a person. He describes his own life, his own agonies, his reaction to the death of his brother, and so on and so on.
Okay. And what does the Gueniza tell us about the coexistence between Jews and Muslims in that time?
That's a tricky question, because on one hand, the Gueniza tells us the story of a Mediterranean society, as Goitain, one of the greatest Gueniza scholars, call it. A society in which Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others were cooperating in various levels of cooperation, in financial world, in some of the social values. Clearly in philosophy, the level of exchange of ideas was very high. And also in terms of one community learning from the other and adapting some customs of the other communities. And to a certain extent, the world of the Gueniza is a very nice model for contemporary globalization world in which various people of various origins live. Yet we do have to remember that it was under a structure in which there was a governing force, and that the official status of Jews and Christians wasn't as that of Muslims, and also that the sorrow of I would say ethnical and religious tensions erupted once in a while. So on one hand, I think that there is some positive models that we can see in the Gueniza. On the other hand, I think it's also important to remember that we should not portray it as idyllic a certain society in the past, maybe also as it is in the present, to recognize that each society has its strengths and weaknesses, and we better look at both of them in order to find ways